The purpose of this video is to provide you with a quick overview on some of the elements and expectations for your prospectus oral presentation that will be conducted during the on-site session during this semester. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about, again, what are some of the elements that should be going into this presentation. This is going to sound very much like and have a lot of repetitive information relative to what goes into our written prospectus. But we do have some tools available for you to really kind of organize what the oral presentation will look like. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about some tips to make your presentation really effective and some common mistakes to avoid that students often make during these presentations. So our outcomes here again is to identify the elements in a prospectus presentation, talk about the importance of each element and what the focus should be for each of those, what should be emphasized within the element and what could possibly be a little more flexible, and then, as I mentioned, identify some tips and common mistakes that are often made. So the way we can organize the oral presentation is much like we talked about organizing the written prospectus. And again, you can think about this presentation having two basic parts or major parts or sections or chapters, and that's the introduction and the methods. We have provided you with templates, PowerPoint templates that you can use as guides as you kind of plug in your information and develop your presentation. These templates are found in Web Study in the materials section, and there's one for each of the three different types of approaches that you may see: quantitative, qualitative, and then a mixed method. These guides are not written in stone. You don't have to utilize every single slide that's in them if it's not appropriate. So you'll have to kind of use your judgment and working with your CTD or your committee members, if you have them, to kind of fine-tune the presentation so it's as concise as it can be, but also as complete as it needs to be. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about how the template relates to some of the elements here in a minute. But those are there for you to use as guides, so you don't have to do a lot of the basic slide development working from scratch. Okay, so the elements in the introduction, if that's how we're going to think about organizing this, are the same as they are basically for the written prospectus. So we're going to have, once we kind of get through the title slides and some of the other kind of introductory slides that you'll see in the templates, we want to get into that background and significance. And so again, some of the same questions we can ask ourselves or we want to present in the presentation is: why this topic? Why is it important? What is the scope? Then we get into the literature review, the actual literature review, and we have slides set up in which you can actually identify specific journal articles or specific resources that you're using as your literature support. But what we really need to see from that, again, is what do we know, what don't we know? What we want to try and avoid doing is just throwing up the abstract for some of your resources and just kind of regurgitating these are the methods, this is what they found, this is the sample size. You really want to get into what's the important information that you can pull from each of those resources or each of those articles as you review them. So it's not an annotated bibliography, your literature review. It really is a synthesis of the literature, so that you can again present that information, the gaps, how you're going to fill it, so it really does support your rationale. And then comes the rationale for the study. So some of the same questions we can kind of present or ask ourselves in developing the rationale, we can again present that within your presentation. The who, what, how, and why. Who is this going to help? What specifically is it going to do for these people? How might it help them? Why would it be important, and why would it help them? And then of course we really want to emphasize that so what question. So we're really going to be honing in on your ability to logically develop an argument and a rationale for the so what factor in your particular question. So using the background and significance, the literature review, and the actual rationale, that's what gets us that so what factor, that we can feel comfortable that this question is answering something that's important. And then you can get into specific aims and your purpose statement, and then you could also want to get into specific hypotheses. You can develop experimental hypotheses as well as null hypotheses. That is up to you how you want to present that. Some people will present both. I don't think we necessarily have to present both, since especially if you're doing a quantitative approach, a null hypothesis is kind of assumed as part of your analysis. But you can again present hypotheses, and you can have more than one. You can have some main hypotheses as well as some secondary hypotheses. Once we get into the methods, again, you're going to describe your setting. Where is the research actually going to take place, if it's appropriate. You're going to talk about resources and personnel includes you. It includes you as the researcher, you as the primary investigator. So you will spend some time, there's a slide set up in there for you to describe what qualifies you to do this particular study. And so what you want to try and emphasize is, beyond the fact that you're a doctoral student, what experiences or what interests or what previous types of work have you done that helps support your ability to perform this particular subject? Have you done previous research in this area? Have you published articles? So we want to see some evidence that you have developed or are developing as a scholar and are going to be able to perform this particular study. Then we get into study subjects, the variables, the intervention if appropriate, the data collection procedures, and data analysis. So in these cases, where appropriate, if we can try and use visuals to explain these things. And in the procedures, this is a great opportunity to develop like a flow chart that shows, what procedures your subjects will actually go through. So if you're doing an intervention study where your subject is going to come to a lab or come to a facility, you can say, here's what happens to our subjects from when they walk in the door, the 15 steps they're going to go through as part of the procedures. And if you can show that in a flow chart, it's very easy for us to understand that and interpret that. So in the methods section, it can get really easy to get really wordy. And so we want to try and avoid that on the slides. We don't want to make our slides overly wordy. You want to present elements in somewhat of a summary, and then you verbally will fill in the information from the slide. So we want to make sure we don't make these slides too wordy. That's probably one of the biggest things that makes it difficult for people to follow your presentation, is if they're trying to read your slides that have 15 or 16 bullet points, very dense, and they're not listening to you. And so you want them to be able to just look at the slide and kind of get the gist of what you're going to talk about, and then you verbally present the information. So we have to be really careful with these method slides. They can get really, really overly wordy. So again, these are some of the same elements that we talked about being present in the written prospectus. And again, you want to present all these same elements. And here again in the method section, you have a little bit of flexibility. If there are some areas that you still haven't quite nailed down, that's okay. Just be transparent about it. Again, if you don't know exactly how you're going to operationally define your dependent variable, then say so. And say, here are some options I'm looking at for how to operationally define my dependent variable. In your data analysis section, if you've thought about sample size, if you've thought about what would be an appropriate sample size for you, if you've done a power analysis, those are great things to include in your data analysis, whether it's in the written prospectus or in the oral. So that's something we want to try and consider. Okay, so to wrap up, here are some tips and some kind of common mistakes that people make that you want to try and avoid. I've been doing this, and our other instructors have been doing this for a long time, so we've seen it all from really outstanding presentations to really not very good presentations. And the not very good presentations tend to have some common issues that make them not very good. And so I want to try and point some of those things out. Probably one of the first things you should do is you're developing your presentation, besides working with the template that's available, is to look at the rubric that we're going to be using to evaluate your presentation. And so that's on, again, in web study, in the materials section, there will be the rubric that we're actually going to use to grade you. So go through that rubric at the beginning before you begin preparing your slides, and then also once you have all your slides together, go through that rubric and see if you're meeting all the expectations. I think that's one of the more common mistakes that people make, is they don't go through the rubric and they really don't know what we're looking for, and so they leave things out, or they don't emphasize what they should be emphasizing. So please examine the rubric and use that to self-evaluate as you're developing your presentation. We also have provided some examples of previous presentations. These are not perfect, but they generally tend to be very good, and so they're good exemplars of what would be good presentations. So look at those to see how people have presented their ideas and what seems to you to look like an effective way to present. One of the things you want to try and make sure you're doing, especially once you have most of your slides together and you start to kind of go through it and practice it, you want to make sure the slides present your ideas in a logical flow. The slides all have to kind of make sense, and there has to be a situation in which you can see how the next slide is related to the previous slide and how they kind of build upon themselves and are related to each other. A lot of times, students that don't have effective presentations, the slides will kind of jump around. They don't seem to go together. So they might be talking about literature review in one aspect of their study, and then they suddenly change gears to a completely different aspect, and they haven't really prepared the audience for this kind of change of flow and these change of ideas. So you want the ideas to flow in a way that tells a convincing and persuasive story. So you're telling us a story of how you've got this question and how you're going to answer it. And so your presentation should really convince us that this question is needed, it's vital, and you can answer it. And so you want to make sure that flows. So before we get to the on-site, I would highly recommend you practicing your presentation, especially with someone who has very little knowledge of your topic. And it could be someone who doesn't even know anything about healthcare or athletic training or whatever field you're from. Do the presentation for them, and if they can understand it and it makes sense to them, then you're in great shape. If it makes absolutely no sense to them, then you probably need to rethink how you're going to present and reorganize some things. So that would be a really, I think, useful thing for you to be able to do. I would also strongly recommend that you have a separate script that you can work from, whether you actually write out what you're going to say word for word and you use that as a script. If you've got notes you want to work from to go through as you go through your slides to remind yourself of things you want to say, that's fine. What I do not want you to do is put everything you want to say on your slide and then read from it. That is a huge no-no. That is not a good presentation. A common mistake that people often do with that is they put everything they're going to say on the slide and they're reading from the slide. What makes it worse is while they're doing that, they have their head turned and they're looking at the screen behind them and they're not looking at their audience and they are reading their slides. That is not an effective presentation. So please do your best to avoid doing that. You want to connect with your audience. You want to try making eye contact, and you cannot do that if you're looking back at your screen and reading. Again, we can read your slides, so you don't need to read them for us. So you want your bullet points on your slides to be easy and quick for us to read so that we can listen to what you have to say. So what you're saying verbally should accentuate and expand upon what's on your slide. Your entire idea should not be on your slide. Okay? Practice the timing of your presentation. We are very strictly going to hold you to a 30-minute time limit. What you don't get through, you won't be able to be evaluated on. So please practice your presentation to make sure you're within that 30-minute time limit. We are going to stop you when 30 minutes is done. And then if you didn't get through your methods section because you were so busy talking about your literature review, then we can't grade you on your methods. And so that's going to become a problem. So please make sure you practice the timing and you've got it down to where it's reasonably close to 30 minutes. There is an expectation that you are going to dress and behave professionally in your presentation. So on Web Study we have the dress code for when you're on campus, and you should adhere to that dress code when you are actually presenting. If you're not presenting that day and you're in the audience, you can dress casually the way you would normally to come to class. But when you're presenting, please dress appropriately and behave professionally. And that goes for the audience as well. So if you're an audience member and you're watching someone's presentation, please be respectful and actually pay attention to their presentation. Don't be working on other things. Don't be checking Facebook. Don't be doing something else. Your classmates are depending on you for constructive feedback, and if you're not paying attention, then they're not going to get good constructive feedback. And it's unfair for them to expect feedback from you and not getting it when they're going to give you feedback. That's just not fair. So we want to make sure we're being fair to each other and behaving professionally. We want to ask questions in a cooperative, constructive way. We want to make comments about someone's presentation in a cooperative and constructive way. Suggestions that we give, whether it's from faculty or students, should be taken in the spirit they're offered. So please don't take suggestions we're going to make personally. They aren't meant to be a personal attack to you or of you. They're meant to make your presentation and your study better. So it might feel a little intense at times that you feel like everyone's criticizing you and everyone's knocking your ideas down, but we're really trying to really help give you food for thought and really trying to help you make your presentation better. Some students really have a hard time with that, but you need to kind of prepare yourself for the fact that you're going to get some pretty extensive and pretty direct feedback. But again, it's all part of the learning process and all meant to make your presentation better. So hopefully this gives you some things to work with as you start to develop your presentation. Again, use your CTDs, use Ms. Hammer, use Dr. Martin, use myself as resources as needed. Use your committee members if you have them. This is when you really can start to develop rapport with your committee, really start to have them understand what it is you're trying to do. So please use those resources as you're developing this presentation, because it's only going to make it an easier presentation for you if you're well prepared. So if you've got any questions, let us know. And we're looking forward to seeing these presentations in a couple months. Thanks. Bye.